Okay, I'm about to alienate a whole lot of people with this, but um liberal identity politics is like really dumb. I don't mean the fight against identity-based oppression and bigotry. Racism is bad, sexism is bad, homophobia is bad. Those things destroy communities, destroy the lives of human beings, and are used to justify the most horrid forms of violence and exploitation. It sabotages the efforts to organize and mobilize the working class. But a lot of well-meaning people haven't the slightest idea what identity-based oppression is, where it comes from, or how to fight it. The goal of this video is not to hate on liberal activists fighting under the banner of identity politics. These activists often do good work in raising awareness of social problems, pushing for progressive legislation, and encouraging people to think more critically about our society and culture. My goal is to critique liberal identity politics, to explain why it fails to get to the heart of the issue of oppression, and how it ignores certain types of oppression altogether. I'm not here to dunk on the SJWs. I'm here to say, hey, SJWs, I like your fighting spirit, but here are some things maybe you haven't considered. In the context of this video, I'm defining identity politics, henceforth abbreviated as IDPOL, as any analysis of identity-based oppression that views this oppression as being the result of the identities of the people involved, or as a conflict between different identity groups, and does not include an analysis of class or look at how that oppression fits into class-based society. Other people may have different definitions they use for the term identity politics, and people who engage in IDPOL may have their own terminology for their approach, and that's fine. Language is subjective and arbitrary. We're talking about a concept, not a word. I just care that you understand what I and other Marxists are talking about when you hear us reference identity politics. I also recognize that IDPOL isn't a monolith. IDPOLsters argue with each other. Some IDPOL analyses are more intelligent and nuanced than others. And there's a spectrum between pure IDPOL on one end and tanky class reductionism on the other. So how about we jump right in? Now, as y'all may or may not have guessed, I'm a chick. I gave myself giant tits so you would know. And also to bring all the subscribers and likers to the yard. And we know it worked because there's like 85 of you now. And I just hope the fame doesn't get to my head. I have a vested interest in destroying sexism. I kinda would like it if the Catholics would stop trying to take my health care away, among other things. So if we use sexism as our primary example, I can at least claim I know what the flying fuck I'm talking about. As a kid, I didn't hear much about sexism or other forms of identity-based oppression. I thought either it didn't exist or it happened far away to people I didn't know. But I learned about the world, was exposed to new ideas, and eventually to the horror of those same very Catholics who raised me and are now trying to take my health care away. I started moving more and more to the left. A pivotal moment in my political development was in 2014 when I got a Tumblr account. I know, cringe, right? I was like really obsessed with The Legend of Korra, and I joined to look at all the fan art. Aw man, those were the good old days, back when Pepe the Frog was still wholesome, and Donald Trump was still irrelevant. Oh, and Homestuck discourse, can't forget the Homestuck discourse. Met some really great people there, some of whom I'm still friends with. Good fucking times. Tumblr had a thriving community of liberal SJWs. Mostly girls in their late teens and early 20s. Mostly people who were kind of social oddballs like me, or actively marginalized by being LBGT or neural atypical. And we talked about our experiences, and analyzed what we knew about other people's experiences. At first, I thought the political discourse was annoying. until I started listening to it. And suddenly my world got much bigger than it had been before. We had interesting debates and discussions. Sometimes they could get heated and nasty. The infighting was atrocious. But it was also fun and exciting. We talked about the patriarchy and systemic inequality, and I learned what the letters in LBGT stand for. Obviously lettuce, bacon, guac, and tomato. It's delicious. I learned that my experiences were not universal, and that the society we lived in could be very complicated and interesting, though it had a lot of dire problems that resulted in a lot of human suffering. Looking back, the discourse was unmistakably liberal, TM, not leftist. They certainly were the type of people who would be comrades nowadays. I think it was mostly because this was the Obama era. Trust in the establishment was relatively high, and political consciousness wasn't ripe yet for anything truly radical. So while I did learn a lot from the Tumblr SJWs, they weren't that great at political analysis. Some pretty important topics were just left out of the discourse. We talked about sexism all the time, but only to point it out, or only in the context of current events. We never once talked about what sexism was, or where it came from. I think we kind of assumed that sexism had always existed, and that getting rid of it was just part of modern progress, like curing cancer or treating diabetes. But we didn't think about it much deeper than that. We saw it as a shitty meme the boys started sharing around thousands of years ago, and I guess they thought it was funny so it never died. Like Rickrolling. Here's a link that discusses that in more detail. In many ways, Marxism is the study of history. Every Marxist analysis begins with a history lesson. Every aspect of our modern society exists for a reason and has an actual material origin. Marxists look to history not just to understand social problems, but for clues as to how to best combat them. Liberals also value history, but as an account of society's past sins, for which we are slowly making amends, one social movement at a time. For liberals, history is just for pointing out social problems, not as a guide to how to solve them. Sometimes we dipped our toes into something approaching material analysis. We sort of believed men benefited from sexism, that they enjoyed being on top of the hierarchy, and I suppose that's partly true in the short term, sometimes. But even an underdeveloped teenage Tumblr feminist knows that men do not benefit from sexism. Not really. Sexism forces men to conform to rigid, unrealistic standards of masculinity. It forces men into tiny, cramped boxes. It encourages behavior that is emotionally and physically self-destructive. I heard some theories about the origin of sexism every now and then. One theory I heard was that human males, like other animals, have an instinctual need to guard their mates to ensure the paternity of their children. Though this one is easily debunked by the fact that there are many cultures where women are not expected to be monogamous. I think the common assumption was that men are bigger than women and gain dominance by beating women up, but very little human interaction involve hands-on physical violence, so I think we can trash this idea too. The theories I heard were often wacky and strangely biologically deterministic. That gender inequality is sort of natural, while at the same time, we also believed that sexism was an idea. And we really did see our fight as an ideological one. We were especially fascinated by the depictions of women in the media. It was a serious problem in our eyes that TV shows had way more male characters than female, that female characters were often sexualized, or had minor roles, or showed little agency. If we could just create more feminist media, and point out sexism in sexist media, We believed this would go a long way in changing the culture. Liberals have a very idealistic view of history and politics, believing it to be a struggle between morals and philosophies, and that the way to change our social reality is to change people's minds. The problem, we believed, was that too many men believed sexist ideology, which they learned from a sexist culture. What we had to do was encourage men to unlearn sexism. Our plan was to run a giant counter-propaganda campaign, basically. And if each and every individual man unlearned their sexism, took the responsibility of self-reflection and self-education, then eventually society would change. Liberalism is also very individualistic. This naturally flows from liberal idealism, because if the problem is an idea, the solution is introspection. We understood that sexism was a systemic issue. In fact, if you had asked us, we would have openly decried the conservative hyper-individualism, especially on economic issues. But we only knew that sexism was systemic because we saw it in the system. We thought systemic sexism was the sum result of millions of sexist individuals committing sexist acts on a day-to-day basis, such as, by example, a boss hiring a man over a more qualified woman. We didn't actually know how the system worked, since we weren't armed with class analysis and historical materialism. Because we didn't know how the system worked, we also believed that the system was trustworthy enough to fix itself. Our solutions were reformist in nature. If we could just get a few sexist bad apples out of positions of power, if we could just get more women and non-sexist men into those same positions, we would win. We would do this primarily by voting. I remember how excited I was to see Hillary Clinton run for president, and how absolutely devastated I was when she lost. Of course, any Marxist can tell you that a shitty establishment neolib like Hillary Clinton was not going to do jack fucking shit for the average woman, but I didn't understand that. And then, if not by voting, then by very peaceful protests, or by canceling those few bad apples on Twitter. Don't get me wrong, I fucking love cancel culture, but just getting a few reactionary fucks fired from their jobs isn't going to rebuild society from the ground up. And that leads me to perhaps the most frustrating aspect of liberal feminism and idpol in general. Its goals are kind of sad. Idpolsters believe that sexism is a barrier to a true meritocracy. That in a perfect world, people would be judged purely on their ability and their intelligence, not on their gender. We wanted a fair hierarchy, but we had no desire to tear hierarchies down. Our favorite statistic to cite was that there were more CEOs named John than there were female CEOs in general, or something like that. I don't remember what it was. And so if we could just get more female CEOs, the problem would be solved. We truly believed that women in positions of power would, by default, make decisions that were in the interests of other women. But the idea of a world with no CEOs was beyond our imagination. When I was a liberal SJW, I knew what sexism was. I knew the right wing was filled with it, and they were very awful and that we had to fight them. But I didn't have any image in my head of what it would look like if we won. I didn't ever take a moment to sit back and close my eyes and dream of a brighter future, the way I learned to do as a Marxist. I guess I thought Hillary Clinton would become president and eventually all the old people with reactionary values would die off. Or the government would pass a magical law protecting women's rights forever and fully. But I also kind of knew that this wouldn't stop the forces of reaction. It would only push them back a few yards. Deep down, I didn't actually think any type of serious victory was possible, though we had no choice but to keep fighting anyway. Either way, the system would never change, even if women's rights increased or decreased within it. Every now and then us liberal feminists would see a victory, or what we thought was a victory. We thought that just by putting women in positions of power, it would make women's lives better. But so far, that hasn't really been the case. Female politicians don't make decisions that are in the interests of women as a whole. And while women's representation in media and in the halls of power has improved, and sexist ideology is no longer openly tolerated like it used to be, life for women in general has gotten harder. Women in many ways are now better off compared to men. That is, the gap between women's rights and men's rights has closed. However, women are kind of miserable. They report feeling significantly less happy and satisfied with their lives than they did 50 years ago. Did fighting for women's rights make women less happy? And if you view this through the lens of id pol, as I just described, this is absolutely baffling. We've made all these laws to protect women from sexism, and we've made all these cultural strides. Why isn't it making women's lives better? And the reason this baffles id pollsters is because id pollsters don't really know what women's oppression is. Id pollsters believe that sexism has always existed and might be part of human nature, but also it's a mere idea that we can defeat just by educating people about it. It's a systemic problem, but the solution is for individuals to change their behavior during one-on-one interactions. It's deeply ingrained in our society, but we can fix it with our current government, and by voting for establishment politicians. Liberal feminism views sexism as divorced from history and divorced from the material reality of our lives. If we want to understand this paradox, we need to understand that oppression is a bread and butter problem, not one of ideas, and that oppression is multifaceted as well. We can't just look at women's oppression as a conflict between men and women. We need to understand women's oppression in the context of class-based society. If we introduce a class analysis and a little historical materialism, it makes perfect sense why women have become less happy in recent decades, despite the gains in legal equality. What happened in the past few decades that has made women's lives so much worse? Neoliberalism has happened, my good dude. Neoliberalism! Wages have stagnated. The cost of living has gone up. The post-war economic boom is over, and the Keynesian welfare state from the New Deal has dried up and been dismantled. The reason it's harder to be a woman nowadays is because it's harder to be a person nowadays. Both men and women are oppressed by capitalism. Sexism is simply the fact that women are oppressed more than men. Women's oppression is not the fault of men as a whole. It's the fault of the ruling class. Neoliberalism has been particularly hard for women, which is why women's happiness has decreased relative to men as well as overall. Women don't just have to worry about themselves. They also, according to our culture, are expected to worry about their families and children more than men are. The whole family suffers under neoliberalism, and women take that suffering upon themselves. Women not only have to work long hours outside the home, thanks to neoliberalism, but are also expected to do the majority of housework as well, due to cultural expectations. Women are doubly overworked, doubly undercompensated, and doubly stressed. Life for the average working-class woman in America is not a bright one. Yes, women are treated almost as well as men in the modern era, but the way men are treated is absolutely fucking terrible, so that's not necessarily something to celebrate. While women's rights in comparison to men have improved, rights for working-class people in general have eroded. Even if the disparities between men and women completely disappeared, women would still be less happy than their mothers and grandmothers who lived in more stable and prosperous times. So have women's rights actually improved since the 70s? Not really. And the advancement of women's quote-unquote rights and the degradation of rights for working class people as a whole are actually linked. It's no coincidence they happened around the same time. And thanks to class-blind liberal feminism, the ruling class could distract us from their vicious intentions by granting workers concessions in ways that didn't actually challenge their profits. That is, by giving in to the popular demand that women be treated equally to men. Take, for example, women being quote-unquote allowed to work outside the home. Women from poor families have always worked outside the home. But better-paying professions have not always been open to women. During the post-war boom, many families had the money to live off of one income, and women stayed home to be housewives and moms. But that changed in the 70s with the rise of neoliberalism. Thanks to the evisceration of labor rights, wages began to stagnate relative to economic growth. Suddenly, families could no longer support themselves on dad's income alone. Women, who before would have been able to stay home, now had to go out and do wage labor. So of course there was a huge social movement to end sex discrimination in the hiring process. And the ruling class gave in to this demand, partly because of pressure from the working class, but also because bosses were all too happy to have a greater pool of workers to choose from. This meant that competition for jobs increased, which meant that wages and working conditions got even worse. I don't mean to say that the end of discrimination was bad, it wasn't. But without a confident, powerful working class movement to back it up, the victory is kind of a hollow one. Another double-edged victory for women is that they gained the right to open credit cards and apply for loans without needing their husband's permission. Well, this also is due to neoliberalism and the deteriorating conditions for the working class. Stagnating wages meant that working class families were having trouble keeping up with their expenses. We saw the rise of the personal credit industry. Women were given the right to open credit cards because they needed them to provide for themselves and their families. And credit companies were all too happy to expand the pool of people they could trap in vicious cycles of debt. It is an objectively good thing for women and for the working class as a whole that women gain the right to participate in the economy on an equal playing field as men. But equality is not good enough. Women need liberation. Is a woman really liberated if she is allowed to work outside the home as much as a man can, for the same long hours, same poverty wages, and in the same terrible conditions as a man? Is a woman really liberated if she is allowed to go as deeply into debt as a man can? From an id pol perspective, yes, as long as men and women are being treated the same, it's fair. But that doesn't mean the material reality of women's lives has improved in any serious way. Likewise, does it really count as women's liberation if women are allowed to occupy the same positions of power that men can? Have things improved for women if female CEOs have equal right to exploit and dominate workers that male CEOs have, including female workers? Is it really women's liberation if a female politician can institute the same authoritarian austerity policies that a male politician can? And that, at the end of the day, is why liberal identity politics fails, because it's blind to class. Id pol doesn't want liberation. It just wants people from every identity group to be oppressed evenly. Id pollsters often are not only blind to the horrors of capitalism, but may even celebrate capitalism. After all, under capitalism, even a woman can wield tyrannical power as a landlord or a factory owner. And because of this, liberal id pol can actually be used to promote some highly reactionary agendas dressed in progressive disguise. My favorite example of this is perhaps the movie Captain Marvel. I didn't watch it because I don't hate myself, But we see a movie which on its surface is about girl power, and women can do anything, and don't be sexist, you stupid losers. But in reality, it's just a 2-hour-long commercial for the US military, which is one of the most oppressive and violent institutions on Earth. Women's liberation can only happen alongside working-class liberation. Women would have drastically more control over their lives if they received higher wages, had better working conditions, as well as guaranteed access to health care, housing, and education. Women do not need female CEOs. Women need to overthrow the bourgeoisie and participate in the public ownership and democratic control of our economy. This, by the way, is why Alexandra Kollontai did not call herself a feminist. She associated feminism with the liberal feminists of her era, who wanted just what we talked about, the right to go out and own factories like their husbands did, the right to oppress women workers, and she was right not to associate herself with such people. Marxism doesn't just present a clearer picture of what liberation looks like, it also helps us to understand oppression better as well. I mentioned earlier that liberal feminists don't really have a good idea of where sexism comes from or what it is. But you know who did? Friedrich Engels. If you read The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, Engels describes how women's oppression doesn't occur in all societies, how it appeared along the same time class-based society appeared, how society's productive capacity increased due to the development of agriculture and the domestication of animals. And since this production increase happened in the type of work that men do, attitudes about men and women shifted. The need to control women's behavior and sexuality came about with the rise of private property, as wealthier men wanted to ensure the paternity of any children who might inherit that property. We also learn how the modern nuclear family is very profitable to capitalism. For the ruling class, the nuclear family is a perfect model to allow men to pass on their property. But it also makes working class men easier to exploit. A man who is under constant extreme pressure to provide for a wife and kids with little community support is going to work very hard and complain very little. Likewise, a working-class woman who is tied to a single man will do a lot of unpaid domestic labor, raising up the next generation of workers and freeing up her husband to go work himself to death. Of course, just as the modern nuclear family was created by capitalism, and it helps capitalism, capitalism is also eroding at the nuclear family too, such as by forcing working-class women to leave their children and work outside the home, as I discussed earlier. Capitalism is filled with contradictions. Understanding and accepting these contradictions is important to understanding the problem as a whole. As Marxists, we can understand how certain reactionary ideologies directly benefit the ruling class. Sexism and other forms of identity-based oppression are very much a part of the way the ruling class tries to control and micromanage the lives of working-class people. The nuclear family, as I already explained, is part of capitalism, and so it makes sense why so many segments of the ruling class push family values. The attack on reproductive rights is part of this. By cutting off access to abortion and birth control, the ruling class can force the working class to birth as many replacement workers as possible, and force the parents into a state of poverty and precarity, which will force them to accept lower wages and worse working conditions. Of course, not all segments of the ruling class want to restrict reproductive rights, but not all segments of the ruling class have the exact same material interests. That's why the government has both Republicans and Democrats. Just as some segments of the ruling class use liberal identity politics as a propaganda tool to hide their agenda, other segments of the ruling class use oppressive ideology for the same purpose. Through sexism and racism and other isms, the bourgeoisie encourage workers to blame each other for their problems instead of the people in power. And with id pull on one side and reaction on the other, the ruling class also encourages a culture war, which pits workers against each other on yet even more lines. Especially since id pull blames entire segments of the population for oppression, not just the ruling class. For example, by saying sexism is men's fault. Culture war hype is a useful way to distract the working class from the bread and butter reality of everyday oppression. If we approach problems like sexism through a Marxist perspective, we have a much clearer picture of what it is we're dealing with, and what sort of steps we should take to solve the problem. I use the example of sexism since it's the one I'm most familiar with. But maybe we can look at a different example. What about racism? Just as in the case of sexism, liberal id pollsters see racism in idealistic and individualistic terms. They recognize systemic racism, but see it as the sum result of millions of racist actions by racist individuals over time, thanks to racist ideology. They believe that the issue of racism is solved mostly through counter-propaganda, encouraging white people as individuals to unlearn their racist ideas. For example, by the belief that cops will become less racist if we make them go through anti-bias training, instead of realizing the truth that cops are racist because the role they play in class-based society encourages them to be. Liberal id pollsters see racism in a rather ahistorical manner. Id pollsters seem to believe that slavery and the modern forms of hyperexploitation black people suffer is the result of racism. But Marxists understand it is in fact the other way around. Slavery happened because the bourgeoisie in the early days of capitalism could not make a profit without a cheap source of disposable labor. That racism came about as a way to justify the hyper-exploitation of black workers and to discourage black and white workers from fraternizing and thus potentially organizing. We see how capitalism continues to profit from the hyper-exploitation of black workers, which gives us the prison industrial complex. We see how racist policing, including Jim Crow, was/is part of the ruling class's broader agenda to micromanage working people and discourage rebellion through terror. We see how effective racism is as a tool to distract white people from the oppression they themselves face, such as when Ronald Reagan used racist dog whistles to convince white working class people to let him eviscerate the welfare state. How racism has historically been a bludgeon the ruling class uses to smash organizing efforts. Factory owners in the olden days would often pit white workers and black workers against each other by keeping them separate, paying them different wages, etc. When a white union, which refused to organize with black workers, went on strike, the boss would bring in black scabs, who of course had no incentive to honor the strike of people who were racist toward them. As in the case of sexism, id pull anti-racism can be wielded like racism itself to disguise class conflict, distract workers from the bread and butter reality of oppression, and to pit the working class against itself. Id pull presents the idea that white people as a whole are responsible for black oppression, when in reality both are oppressed, just that black people are oppressed worse. The more reactionary half of the ruling class uses this for their own rhetoric. This creates a culture war issue that the entire ruling class can use to divide and distract workers. We even see the ruling class use id pull language to peddle reactionary ideologies, such as when a corporation tries to paint itself as benevolent by co-opting the language of diversity and inclusion into their advertising. Or this shit show of a film that is supposed to be about anti-imperialism and black empowerment, but the plot involves a CIA agent overthrowing a revolutionary government and reinstating an absolute monarch. And, we're supposed to be happy about this? Hey, 2 Marvel movies referenced in one video. What the fuck, Marvel? Why do you have such a hard-on for American imperialism? I mean, I know why, but... Thank you for being there to help me prove my point. Finally, we see the conflicting goals between id-pol anti-racism and the Marxist fight for universal liberation. The id-pollsters are fighting for a fair meritocracy, where our hierarchies are determined by objective criteria instead of by race. Id-pollsters would like to see black people treated as well as white people, but don't seem to care much for the fact that would leave most of the world's black people in a state of poverty and precarity. One time, someone actually said to me that oppression by the police would go away if we hired more black cops. They actually said to me, "No, silly, oppression would be gone because the cops would be black and it wouldn't be racist then." Because apparently, 1, black people magically are unable to participate in racism, and 2, the absence of racism magically erases the role the cops play in oppressing and terrorizing the working class as a whole. I lost my fucking mind. Equality is important, but equality is not enough for liberation. Black people do not need a chance to become oppressors themselves. Black people need to overthrow the bourgeoisie and participate in the public ownership and democratic control of the economy. Basically, the problem with liberal identity politics is, well, it's liberal. It's individualistic instead of social in its outlook, and idealistic instead of materialistic. It wants to rid the world of identity-based oppression without addressing the reason why identity-based oppression exists. Id-pol sorts working people into groups, assumes people from different groups have fundamentally conflicting interests, pits working people against one another, and obscures class politics. For these reasons, the ruling class can wield id-pol as a weapon against the working class the same way it wields identity-based oppression itself. Ultimately, the reason id-pol is incapable of solving the problem of oppression is because it doesn't actually want to do so. Id-pol is completely tolerant of capitalism at the end of the day. Not once during my days as a Tumblr SJW did I hear a call for abolishing rent-seeking or advocate the public ownership of the means of production. And certainly no one advised me to join a labor union or read theory. During my days as a Tumblr SJW, I could use fancy terms like cultural appropriation and patriarchy and internalized misogyny, but I wouldn't have been able to explain something as simple as the labor theory of value. Id-pol tolerates and sometimes even celebrates capitalism. Liberalism is the ideology of capitalism after all. Id-pol is perfectly content to create a world where the poor are worked to death and small countries are bombed out of existence by big countries, as long as the people doing that exploitation and violence are a diverse sample of the population. Liberal identity politics as an ideology is not a friend of the working class, and thus is no friend to marginalized groups either. This is not to say that many liberals, as individuals, don't care about things like wages or workers' rights. Many liberals are, after all, working-class people who suffer the horrors of capitalism every day. You yourself, dear viewer, might be one of those people. And if so, I consider you to be a comrade. I just hope you walk away from this video a bit more class-conscious than you were before. We working class people will not be able to stand up for ourselves and fight for our own interests if we aren't able to unify and work together. It cannot be overstated how much identity-based oppression and bigotry blocks this from happening. But history teaches us the best way people overcome bigotry is the class struggle itself, fighting alongside one another for our common material interests. And it's a double-sided fight, because while overcoming bigotry is necessary for working class liberation, the reverse is also true. All forms of oppression come from class-based society. It doesn't come from anywhere else. And there is no way to defeat oppression without liberating the working class as a whole. If we want to fight oppression, we have to actually fight oppression. That means going straight to the source. It means taking on the boss battle and actually literally fighting your boss. It means challenging class-based society itself.